Welcome to the Boxing Gossip channel. Please be sure to press subscribe if you haven't already done so before. I want to start this video by giving a massive shout out to Ryan, who is the latest person to sign up to my Patreon, and he's made a request video through Patreon for me to discuss a certain topic, and it's a pretty good topic actually. So thanks to Ryan for support. Thanks to Ryan for the support, and thanks to Ryan for the topic proposed. My request is for you to do a bit of a roundup of the light heavyweight division. Who do you see sitting at the top in a year or two, and particularly where does Badou Jack fit into the mix? Can he be competitive against the killers coming through at the minute? Good question, and we've actually had a little talk, not in any level of depth, but we've had a little talk about the light heavyweight division in the past, because it's a kind of interesting division, the dynamic within it at present, and some of the changing faces within the division. So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of an overview of how I see it, and then we'll come on and maybe focus on Badou Jack for a little bit in a moment or so. But first I'd say the light heavyweight division is a division that's in a period of transition. A lot of the names at light heavyweight are either departing the scene or are aged. Bernard Hopkins, who for so long was towards the top of the division, has thankfully finally made the decision to hang up his gloves. More recently, Andre Ward, commonly regarded as the pound for pound #1 in the sport of boxing, has departed the sport and departed the light heavyweight division. One of the other guys right at the top of the light heavyweight division, Adonis Stevenson, I'm just actually typing him into Boxrec now to see how old he is. Adonis Stevenson is now 40 years old. So for me, it's a division in a period of transition. We look historically at the names, your Chad Dawsons, your John Pascals, your Bernard Hopkins, your Andre Wards, those sort of guys either at the end of the road, especially in Hopkins and Ward's case, or kind of coming to the end of the road in terms of your Dawsons and your Pascals. Adonis Stevenson, I don't want to say he's come to the end of the road, because he's still a guy who's won his last few fights and he's still competing at the top of the division. I believe he's still the WBC world champion, but at 40 years old, his time in the sport has got to be limited surely. And if he does continue to fight on, and he's been incredibly inactive of late, but if he does continue to fight on, you'd have to assume it's only a case of another year or two on the sport before he finds his exit. So putting those guys to a side, you're left with, for me, 4 names who are already operating at a world-class level. And those 4 names are Sergey Kovalev, Badou Jack, Artur Beterbiev, and Dmitry Bivol. Of those names, for me, Sergey Kovalev has to be the consensus #1 based on his resume. Badou Jack, interesting. For me, Badou Jack deserves huge credit based on his performances at 168 pounds. And in his one fight so far at 175 pounds, he looked pretty devastating against Nathan Cleverly. Up at 168, he got the draw against James DeGale, that most people believe DeGale was fortunate to leave that fight with a draw. He beat George Groves. Real strong form from Badou Jack at 168 pounds. Then you've got Artur Beterbiev, who recently won a version of the world title, and Dmitry Bivol, who again recently won a version of the world title. Beterbiev and Bivol have competed at a lesser level than Kovalev and Badou Jack as well. But those are the 4 guys who you would say kind of make up the world title scene right now, I guess. Now, I wouldn't want to exclude Adonis Stevenson from that conversation. I'm just more thinking that there's doubts surrounding him. There were lots of rumours that Stevenson would fight Badou Jack. For whatever reason, that fight hasn't quite materialised, and we're now looking at a 40-year-old guy who's been inactive, and as far as I know, who doesn't have a fight announced. So looking at the next level down, you do have your contenders who've been on the scene for a while. So I earlier on in the video referenced Chad Dawson, John Pascal. These guys are just about hanging on to their light heavyweight careers. You've got guys like Eleider Alvarez, Sullivan Barrera, who are, top class fighters, international class fighters, but, not fighters who you're necessarily looking at as guys who are coming to the top of the division. And then you've got your contenders, or your prospects, if you like, who are guys who are coming through. So we'll touch on those guys in a second. But before we do, let's talk about the ages of the players involved. So Ward, Hopkins, they've left the party. Adonis Stevenson, 40. Sergei Kovalev, 34. Badou Jack, 34. Even Artur Beterbiev, who feels like a more recent addition to the scene, 26. Sullivan Barrera, 35. Elida Alvarez, 33. I mean, of those names I've mentioned, Artur Beterbiev is the youngest at 32. Now, Dmitry Bivol is the one who's already kind of in and around that world title level, admittedly with a weak resume, but he's in and around that sort of level at only 26 years old. So Dmitry Bivol is the one who stands out amongst that group as being the youngest and the one with the longest left in the sport. You kind of, in the question that was put to me by Ryan, he actually asked about how do you see the division sitting in a year or two, and realistically, looking at 2 years from now, Stevenson will be 42, Kovalev and Jack will be 36, Sullivan Barrera will be 37, Alvarez will be 35. We have to look at these guys being in the autumn of their career. We have to start looking at the next generation to come through. And who's that next generation to come through? Well, Dmitry Bivol, has to be right towards the top of the conversation. He looked absolutely devastating last time out on Eddie Hearn's card in Monaco, where he fought and beat, I think the guy's name was Trent Broadhurst for the WBA World Light Heavyweight title. Now look, beating Trent Broadhurst doesn't necessarily put you towards the top of the conversation. And in fact, BoxRec only have him at number 13 in the division, despite the nature of that win. But it was the visual impression that he gave which left you thinking that this is a guy already at a world-class level. Clearly, he's a very, very dangerous puncher. Technically, he looks very, very refined and pretty complete already at this stage of his career. He seems like a guy with great timing, great accuracy, real sharp, smart punching, and he's going to be a tough guy to beat. So Dmitry Bivol, certainly the name you'd be putting right at the top of your list if you're talking about this division in 2 years' time. For me, age is a factor. Sometimes people prefer to talk about styles rather than age, but when you're talking about guys in their mid 30s and 40s in Adonis Stevenson's case, age is certainly a factor. A guy like Sergei Kovalev, a guy who's a strong guy, a big puncher, a guy like Sullivan Barrera, you kind of get the impression watching these guys that these aren't Bernard Hopkins type fighters. These are not necessarily fighters who are going to be still at world title level aged 40, and because of that, Dmitry Bivol, you kind of think is the one who maybe at his prime if some of these big fights between the contenders we've named are already mentioned. Looking at some of the guys who are not quite yet in that world title scene, but some of the guys who are coming through. Let's start with talking about Marcus Browne. Now, Marcus Browne is in and around the top of the heavyweight division. Let's talk about his resume. So, wins so far over Gabriel Campillo, the unbeaten Shawnee Monahan, Thomas Williams Jr. Those are all names in and around the top 20. He's beaten them. He's got a few of those wins in decent fashion. My question with Marcus Browne is, having watched him once or twice, and look, I haven't seen every Marcus Browne fight. I haven't been watching Marcus Browne since the amateurs, so if you have, you may know more than me. If so, please leave me a comment, educate me. But Marcus Browne, to the eye test, doesn't look, to my eye, to have the complete upside of a guy like a Dmitry Bivol. He doesn't look as dangerous, as complete as a guy like Dmitry Bivol. One guy who perhaps may tick that box on the way up, Alexander, and I do apologise if you're watching because I'm not good with my pronunciations, but Wojcik, who BoxRec already have as high as number 6 in their rankings. Now, he's not necessarily a young gun. He's 30 years old already. but he's wrapped up recent wins against the likes of Tommy Karpensi, Yaneski Gonzalez, Isaac Chilemba, and I believe I'm right in saying he was the first man to actually stop Isaac Chilemba. Now, I'll be honest, I haven't seen chapter or verse of Gvozdic's fights. I know people talk about him very, very highly. I've seen clips. I've looked at a little bit of YouTube in advance of making this video, but as I said before, he's not someone I've been following from the amateurs, etc. I haven't seen his full library of action. But he looks a very dangerous fighter, clearly a heavy-handed guy. From what I've seen, it looks like he's another one of these guys who has a real strong technical background, you know, not just a slugger, so to speak. And I think he's certainly a name to throw into the mix. The other one, and I guess you could say this guy is a bit more of a wild card, is Anthony Yarde. Now, Anthony Yarde clearly passes the eye test. Fans of British boxing are going to know that. 26 years old, 13-0, 12 knockouts, and he's been running through opposition like a hot knife through hot butter. At the time of filming, he's scheduled to fight Nikolai Sezloka next weekend at the Copper Box. And you know, whilst I don't expect Sezloka to be remotely competitive in that fight, at least Sezloka is a guy who has competed against some world-class names and has a proven track record of durability. You know, he could ask a few questions of Yarde, he could take Yarde a few rounds, let's hope. But based on the eye test, Yarde is very, very impressive. Real technique, good jab, good distance, good movement, a lethal power. Yeah, a very, very good fighter to watch. Anthony Yarde is all potential at present. His resume is very, very weak. You know, Yarde's had 13 fights, Bivol's had 12 fights, Gvozdic's had 14 fights. Yarde is way behind those guys in terms of the level he's been competing at. But Yarde doesn't have much of an amateur background. He's still relatively young at 26, and yeah, Frank Warren is probably right to take his time with him. So yeah, let's see how he gets on about Sezloka. Let's see how he does. But he looks like a real star in the making. Concerns about Yarde? Well, we haven't really seen him tested so far. What will his stamina be like over longer fights? You know, he's a very heavy set guy. What will that impact will that have on his stamina? The weight class is a big issue for me. Yarde is very muscular. A lot of his fights haven't been made at 175 pounds. They've been made at a slightly higher limit. He's actually missed weight, I believe, on a couple of occasions now, more than one or two. And for me, it will be a very big concern for Yarde if he cannot make 175. I've met Yarde. He's a short guy. He's listed on BoxRec as 6 foot. I don't believe he's that tall. I believe he's slightly shorter than that. And I believe he would struggle up at cruiserweight. So whether he can continue to make 175, given his heavy set build, is going to be a key question as he gets on older in his career. But Yarde, very exciting talent, blue chip prospect. Let's see his progression within the sport. So rounding up, I guess what I'm saying, the next set coming through, if I was to put my chips on people, you could do worse than looking at the likes of Dimitri Bivol, Anthony Yarde, Gvozdyk, Marcus Brown. You know, those are the names of guys. All 4 of them are undefeated. All 4 of them are either 30 years old or younger, and a lot of them look like very hot talents. Those are the guys coming through. Sullivan Barrera, Elida Alvarez, they're on the peripheries. Whether the eye test is telling you they're good enough to mix it at the elite level is an open question. The likes of Sergei Kovalev, Badou Jack, Artur Beterbiev, these guys may end up fighting each other because these guys are currently towards the top of the sport. They're relatively big names. They're marketable fighters. Kovalev and Beterbiev have a substantial history from the amateurs, which could be promoted well. You know, if Kovalev fought Beterbiev, if Adonis Stevenson fought Badou Jack, that would be a real nice setup to give us a #1 in the division. But my thoughts are that probably, if you're asking about 1 year's time, probably those guys will still be at the top of the division. You know, those guys are very established names, and you know, in a year's time, I suspect that we'll still be talking about them as the cream of the crop. If we're talking about 2 years' time, I think age will be starting to catch up with them. Adonis Stevenson will be 42, as I say. Kovalev and Badou Jack will be 36. For me, that is I use the phrase autumn of their career quite a lot on this channel. That is winter of their career type stuff. Now, I'll focus just briefly on Badou Jack because I know you specifically mentioned him in the question, Ryan, and he is a fighter who I find interesting. Badou Jack is someone who perhaps I was a little bit guilty of writing off earlier on in his career. I watched him a few times. I thought he looked a little bit sloppy. I watched a Derek Edwards fight. I saw him get sparked out. I think it was in the first round. And you kind of thought if he was getting sparked out by guys like Derek Edwards in a round, someone like George Groves is going to find his chin and capitalise on that. But Badou Jack has improved exponentially as a fighter. Badou Jack is one of the most improved fighters in world boxing. He's a real all-rounder. Excellent stamina, real strength. He's developed a real good jab. I was actually amazed on the outside how much success he had against Groves and DeGale. He's strong and tough on the inside. You know, he can handle himself in a dogfight on the inside. He's an all-round capable guy with improved technique, improved defense, and improved sort of punch variety and versatility. I really, really like what I see in Badou Jack. He was massive at 168, up at 175. He's come in and he's destroyed Nathan Cleverly. Long-time viewers will know Cleverly, one of my favourite fighters. It was a sorry beating that Cleverly had to take on his way out of the sport. And Badou Jack really deserves to be in the elite conversation based on the fact he probably was the consensus number 168 pounder when he left the division. And his win over Cleverly, for me, already puts him in the top 10 based purely on 175 pound form alone. So Badou Jack deserves to be up there. I actually think Badou Jack has looked at his best probably in his last 2 or 3 fights. You know, Badou Jack for me is a guy who, if he has peaked recently. He's peaked at the age of 32, 33, 34. You know, that's when he's looked at his very, very best. And based on recent performances, despite the fact he's not getting any younger, it's hard to really forecast that a decline is imminent because it hasn't really looked like that to my eyes in his recent performances. So Badou Jack is a guy not to be underestimated. I am guilty of underestimating him in the past, and you know, if that rumoured fight between him and Stevenson does happen, for my money, both of those guys need to fight. He, for me, would probably go into that fight as a favourite. You know, I think he could probably beat Adonis Stevenson, even though Adonis Stevenson is still a dangerous fighter who still poses real challenges, even in his 40s. So Badou Jack, for me, a guy not to be written off, a guy not to be underestimated, a guy who may really benefit from the step up to 175 pounds. He looks like a guy who was cutting weight for a very, very long time at 168 pounds, and clearly that gets harder as you get older. Do I see him as the kind of fighter who will be at his very, very best in a few years' time? Probably not. You know, I'm admitting I'm not seeing any signs of decline in him, but he's a guy who, for me, has a great engine, has a great work rate and output. He does have technique. I'm not saying he's a fighter who's just a scrapper without technique. He's got really improved technique and variety, but I still think that his way of getting stuck into a fight is one of his biggest attributes, and I think that is sometimes more of a young man's game than an old man's game. Do I see these guys like Badou Jack at the top in 2 years' time? Probably not. My instinct is that at that point, Father Time will have caught up, and my instinct is it will be the next generation coming through. Of the names I've mentioned, looking at Marcus Brown, he doesn't quite have the upside of the other 3, I think. Dimitri Bivol, Wojcik, once again, my apologies, Alexander, if I've butchered the pronunciation, and Anthony Yarde. Yarde, the wild card based on the lack of form. Bivol, the one who, for me, is probably very, very much the most exciting. And at the age of 26, you know, he could be someone we're talking about for 5 years or yet to come. Let me know your thoughts. How do you think the light heavyweight division stacks up? Give us your comments on the content of this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the thumbs up button. Please subscribe if you haven't done so before. Please check out the Patreon page like Ryan did, which is linked in the description box, and you know, if you want, you can make a request video. And yeah, other than that, many thanks for tuning in. Always appreciate people who watch my content, and I'm glad you like what we're doing. Cheers.